Thank you very much, Richard. I know the real reason I'm here. I've been putting on a very small charity event of my own recently, and I discover if you want Nick Robinson to attend your event, you've got to book him 6 months in advance. And for Michal Hussain, my wonderful colleague and longtime friend, it's a year. And for, incredibly now, dear Chris Mason, the BBC's political editor, it's 18 months. So a year and a half, your people have got to get in touch with Chris's people to get him. Anyway, so when Richard rang me this morning and asked me if I could imagine how delighted I was to be able to say yes. I wrote a book a few years ago about my eccentric and rather unpleasant childhood in the 1970s. You're all of you too young to remember the 70s, or incredibly well preserved. But the 70s were a peculiar and bleak time in the history of the nation, and I had this personal history that I wanted to narrate, and I was telling my daughter about the depredations of my youth. I was driving her home from school, and she was reading in the back of the car, and I said, you know, when Daddy was young, we didn't even have a car. And she looked up from her book and said, oh, when were they invented? And there's something really strange that has happened. Obviously, young people have always looked back on what my children call the black and white days and have said, it's prehistory, everything's changed, everything is better, we do things in a different way. But something else has changed that is, I think, really profound. And it's affected, we are aware of its effect on our psyches and on many aspects of our social life, but I don't think we've yet taken on board its impact on our politics. And that's the kind of context for what I want to say to you about what's going on in the States at the moment, and possibly a conversation we could have when I'm done and we have questions about what's going on here as well, though frankly my expertise is much more on the States than here. But it is all in the context of these things. There is just nothing, it seems to me, that is the same after these became ubiquitous, and particularly, of course, the social media contained on them became ubiquitous as well. It's something that changed, and we know it changed, our social life and our children's lives, and we're worried about it, and we talk about it. But that same daughter, actually, who's 20 now, the other day was at home, and the delivery came, the shopping delivery, and we'd ordered some beer. We lived very blameless lives, like 4 bottles of beer. And they wouldn't let her have receipt of it because she couldn't find her ID. And I was thinking, you know, she could go back up to her room and log on to God only knows what when it came to harmful content, and could have been since she was very young. In other words, we are aware now that we overprotect children in the face-to-face world and massively underprotect them online, aware to the extent that it's a live discussion. But it seems to me one of the things we don't discuss is how that impacts our public life and particularly our politics. We became very aware of it on the Today programme a few years ago, in fact, just at the kind of cusp of everything changing with social media, when my dear colleague Jim Naughtie was introducing Jeremy Hunt, who was then the Culture Secretary. And he got the consonants mixed up. People may remember it. It was 5 to 8 in the morning, peak audience time, and a word went out on the Today programme that really shouldn't. And the editor, we have the news, and during the news you can talk while there's a piece going out. The editor came in and said to Jim, look, Jim, obviously a word's gone out that shouldn't have gone out. Let's say something before you interview Mr. Hunt. Let's just say, obviously, this was a mistake, and move on from there. And Jim turned to the editor and said, oh, do you think anyone would have noticed? And the point, I'm with Jim in a sense, because actually in the pre-digital age, yes, of course people would have noticed. They might have chatted about it over the water cooler. But this kind of sense of the absolute, immediate, and huge publicity given to any gaffe of any sort just was not there. Not in our broadcasting, and crucially, not in our politics. And it was really brought home to me, the Jim thing, a year later when I was in Japan at the anniversary of the Fukushima nuclear disaster. And I was interviewing, in a rather stilted fashion, a Japanese professor who was right in the middle of the countryside. It was a tea ceremony. It was all a bit stilted. I speak no Japanese. They didn't speak much English. And they said to me at one stage, where are you from? And I said, I'm from the BBC. And they said, oh, which program? And I said, well, it's not a World Service program, it's a domestic program, so you won't have heard of it. It's called the Today program. And the professor turned to me and said, Jeremy Hunt. And you realize then, and we were just beginning to grasp then, the extent to which everything was chopped up and sent around the world and used potentially against you. And our politicians began to know it. They were so relaxed in what you might call the old days. Politicians, to an extent like Obama, but I was in the States in George W. Bush's time. George W. Bush, who was interviewed by my colleague Matt Fry, who tells the story of they finished the interview. Bush says, how was that for you, Matt? Did you like it? And Matt says, yes, thank you very much. Before you go, do you want to see the Rose Garden? And they go out to the Rose Garden. Do you want to see the library corridor? They go down to the library corridor. Do you want to see the staterooms? They go to the stateroom. Matt actually finds himself staying to the President of the United States. Look, I'm terribly sorry, but I've got to go somewhere. That degree of relaxation, which Bush had in spades, that humor that Bush had in spades. A friend of mine was introduced to him. They do this thing called the grip and grin, the White House grip and grin at Christmas, where you go and the Secret Service introduce you by name to the president and you have your photo taken. And my friend worked for the Times and was introduced to Bush, and Bush said, I think we just met. And actually, they hadn't just met. It had been someone from London, from the Times, who was sent out. But at least Bush remembered that the Times newspaper, the Times of London, and all the rest of it. But my friend, being kind of gently educated in a public school environment in Britain, found himself saying to the president, because he felt unable to contradict him, found himself saying, yes, we might have met. We might indeed have met. To which Bush turns to his wife and said, well, you'd think he'd have remembered. But that sort of insouciance, that enjoyment of the role is something I think we have squeezed out of our politics, and we've squeezed it out at our peril. And when you look at the situation now and you look at the politics, not only of this country, but also right around the Western world, there are all sorts of things we complain about, populism, etc., and there are all sorts of real causes of real problems. But I do think one of the underlying ones that all of us, as investors, as human beings, need to think about is the impact that has been had on everything, on all public life, by social media and how we deal with it. It seems to me to be one of the great kind of complexities of our time. And in a sense, I mean, probably people have always thought this about their times compared with previous times. But in a sense, I think it is fair to say that the problems that our politicians have to grapple with now are simply more complex than they once were. And I've never been someone who hates politicians or demeans politicians. I think it's a tough job to do. And you can see with individual ministers now, but with politicians more widely, just a sense of pulling levers and nothing much happening, and trying to find some way around that, and trying to find some way of energizing us as well, which they used to be able to do so easily, at least the better ones. Ronald Reagan, back in the day, I think this is probably an apocryphal story because I don't think he ever did stand for mayor of a small town, but there is a story about him standing before he was president, when he was still in the acting union and thinking of going to politics, a small town in California, and he goes to the park with his minders and he goes up to someone on a park bench, says, the name's Ronald Reagan, running for mayor of this small town, hope I can count on your support. And the guy on the park bench says, what are you going to do about them ducks? And Reagan looks around, there are ducks that are wandering around the park. And Reagan says, sir, I will gather them ducks up, I'll pen them up in the corner of the park. They won't bother you again. The man says, well, you're not getting my vote. I love them ducks. I want more of them around. Luckily, there's a second person on a second park bench. Reagan goes up to him. Name's Ronald Reagan, running for mayor of this small town. The guy says, what are you going to do about them ducks? Reagan says, them ducks, I let them run free, sir. Them ducks part of this park. And the man says, well, you're not getting my vote. I hate them ducks. I'd shoot them. Now, at this point, I'm getting to the point of the story now. At this point, Reagan's minders thing is not really cut out for this politics business, and they're kind of thinking about going. But what they haven't spotted is that Reagan is even more enthusiastic than he initially was, and he's seen a third person on a third park bench, and there's this, and he's already steaming up to them. Name's Ronald Reagan, running for mayor of this small town. Hope I can count on your support. And the person says, what are you going to do about them ducks? And Reagan, without pausing, grabs her by the shoulders and says, Madam, on the subject of the ducks, I'm with you. And that kind of thing just is very difficult to bring off, it seems to me, in the modern world. And I think there's a kind of element where we are expecting of our politicians almost too much because of these confounded things and the way in which everything they say has got to be so past and cautious. And you all know it, you know, people who listen to the Today program, you will be frustrated as we are when you get some junior minister just playing a straight bat. It feels worthless. But actually, looking at it from their perspective, there is so little to be gained now in the modern era from engagement. And that's something, it seems to me, that we've got to try to sort out, and they've got to sort out as well. As for what's actually happening at the moment in the States, I think it is fair to say that the potential outcomes for investors and for America more widely are probably grimmer than we currently necessarily grasp. The best outcome, in a sense, for America, I think a lot of Americans feel, is a straight win for either ticket. Whether that's a great outcome for investors, I'm not quite so sure. It's interesting hearing that discussion. I was in at the back of it for the end of the technology discussion. They were talking about the breakup of big tech. You think of the way that both of the parties are approaching Lina Khan, the Federal Trade Commissioner, who is, you know, if anyone is going to break up big tech, it's her. She's really got the bit between her teeth. She's an extraordinary, energetic woman. She has huge support, and what's really interesting about it is she has huge support in the Republican Party, and she has huge support in the Democratic Party, but she also has huge opposition in both of those parties. And I do wonder, for instance, if Kamala Harris is to win and have a 50-50 tie in the Senate, which is probably the best outcome from the Democratic perspective that they could possibly hope for, because West Virginia will be lost to them, and this is not a great year for them in other states as well, and they feel as if they're behind. But say they manage to get to 50-50, so Walz is the casting vote, so they just about hang on there, and they win the House, which is, I think, more likely, particularly if she wins the presidency. What does she do with Lina Khan? How does she deal with all of the pressures that there are for either a breakup of big tech and the kind of real bit between the teeth, almost populist economics on the left, that she will be persuaded by some significant figures? You think of Elizabeth Warren, the senator, who once herself ran for the presidency, or at least for the nomination. You think of significant people in the party who want to do that, but you also think on the other side of really significant people who are backing Harris now, West Coast tech bros, those who haven't gone to the Republicans, who are equally saying to her, and actually saying publicly the other day, sack Lina Khan. We want to get rid of her. We don't want all of that stuff. So there's immediately a kind of a party argument that I think gets worse if she really genuinely has the ability to do the stuff that she wants to do, whatever it is. And of course, famously, we don't really know what it is, because she is a very last-minute candidate. That's not her fault. But she's also changed her position, simply factually, from a lot of the things she used to believe. So she is, in a sense, quite an unknown quantity. And if she were to get in and have the power to do the stuff that she wants to do, I think it's fair to say that everything is on the table, including some things that would make the Biden administration look quite restrained when it came to government spending, but also, you know, in things as basic as energy, the cost of energy. She used to oppose fracking. She now says she doesn't oppose fracking, but she says she doesn't oppose fracking because she needs to win Pennsylvania, where there is a lot of fracking. Once Pennsylvania is won, does she then come under a lot of pressure in the party to go in a different direction? If they're in a position where they're in power in Congress, it seems to me potentially she does. Go to the other side, go to Trump, and go to a Trump blowout, which I think, frankly, is more likely. So Trump wins the presidency. the Republicans win the Senate, which they're likely to do, and they keep the House as well. What does Trump do? And there's all sorts of talk about what he does, but frankly, again, I don't think anyone has got the foggiest idea. One of the things that really, really is interesting about Trump, it seems to me, is that if he does take over, he is a lame duck pretty much from day one. And J.D. Vance, the vice president, is immediately the guy in the center of everything. But how do Trump and Vance differ? How does Vance differ? How does that right of the party differ from the kind of barstool conservatives who support Trump? Really good example. Trump has tried to avoid talking about this thing, Agenda 2025, that some of you might have come across. It's all there on the internet. It's the Heritage Foundation and other right-wing think tanks who've got a kind of program for government, including economic government. But one of the things they want to do is ban pornography. Now, actually, you know, would Trump ban pornography? I doubt it. Would his supporters, watching the NASCAR, if you went around, would you say, do you want to ban pornography? No, I don't think they frankly would. I just don't think it's top, at least, of their agenda. In other words, there are fissures within the Republican. We think of the Republican Party as being kind of entirely in the thrall of Donald Trump and taken over by him. And to an extent, of course, that is true. He has had an enormous impact on them. Kind of hostile takeover. And during the course of this election, right through the primaries, of course, they were very much in his thrall. But the idea that he's taken them over in the long term, I don't think is quite there. And I think, you know, you think back to last time when he won and it was a surprise and the stock market tanked and everyone thought that's the end of everything. And actually within, was it days or weeks at least, everything was kind of back to normal on the investment front. And there is this kind of sense with Trump that a lot of the things that he might do, he might equally not do. And there's a sort of suck it and see side to it. But as I say, also a real chance that fights within his party actually do as much damage to him and to his agenda, if indeed he has an agenda, as they would to Harris and hers. But sadly for America, the more likely outcome at the moment, we keep saying it's very close. Well, it is very close. I mean, the fact is that in the kind of 6 or 7 key states, the places where there might be a victory on either side, all the polls, or the averages in each of those states, are within the margin of error. So it is simply impossible to know who's going to win. But it looks as if it will be very close. And if it is very close, then that is a really difficult few days. I was amused to see the other day all the big broadcasting organizations, including the BBC, actually saying, this is how we're going to cover the election. This is our election night coverage, as if somehow there's going to be a result that night. Well, I doubt it, actually. I really genuinely do doubt it. I shall be doing the Today program the day after from Washington, D.C. I do not expect to be able to say that anyone has won. And there are 2 reasons for that. The first is that if it's a narrow win on either side, then plainly it's going to be contested. And we look back to, you sort of assume that the Democrats don't contest, and it's absolutely true that they have not challenged the result of a Democratic election in the sense that he did, that Trump did. But you look back to 2000 and the hanging chads and all that stuff in Florida. There was a really significant effort by the Florida delegation of the Democrats in Congress for the result of the election not to be certified. Actually kind of mirror image of what Trump tried to get Pence to do. And Al Gore, who was not only the candidate but also the vice president, refused to go along with it and just said, no, we can't. If the Supreme Court has decided to give the election to George W. Bush, which it did, I've got to go along with it, and for the good of the Republic, that's what I'm going to do. In these circumstances, in similar circumstances, what does Kamala Harris do? With all the pressures, again, all the social media pressures, all the pressures of people on the streets, all the pressures of an American society that has this incredible fissure down the middle now. Does she just accept that Trump has won, say he wins by 2 electoral college votes, which is entirely possible? Do they just accept it? And given the 14th Amendment and the effort that there already has been for Trump to be taken off the ballot as an illegitimate presidential candidate. Do they just give in? I think it's a really dangerous and difficult time for America. And if she just wins, 272, 268, what happens then? We already know that in several American states, including Pennsylvania, the key swing state, they don't count the sent-in ballots, the mailed-in ballots, until after all the votes on the day have been counted. So you're going to have this situation on the day where it will look, it really genuinely will look, from the vote tallies as if Trump has won. You remember what it was like last time. And then gradually through the course of the night, but probably this time with everyone looking at it and waiting for it, you will have gradually the result, the potential outcome changing. That itself is dangerous. But what if it is very, very close and she has just won? And he challenges it. And he challenges it, you think last time, to Georgia, where famously he lifted the phone and asked for them to find 11,000 votes, and they didn't do it. What this time? They've altered the systems. They've altered a lot of their people. The Republicans have people in significant positions in key states, including Georgia, who it is supposed might be a little more willing to go along with Trump in those circumstances. Yes, of course, he won't be president, so he won't have the kind of power of the office. He won't be able to call from the White House. But will that lead, in that very narrow outcome, to real difficulties for America, and possibly for a result that is properly disputed for days, even weeks afterwards? I wouldn't entirely discount that possibility. And there is one further one, which is I mean, it sounds like one of these sort of joke things that people kind of come up with as a sort of banter, but it actually this time could be real. So if you think of the electoral map and you think of the top states that are the swing states, the Rust Belt states, the former Rust Belt states, they now see themselves very much as manufacturing states, and indeed they are. So Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. What if she wins those, but Trump wins the Sun Belt swing states, Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, and keeps North Carolina? In those circumstances, it all comes down, weirdly, to one congressional district in the state of Nebraska, because Nebraska doesn't do first past the post voting. It's one of only two states that doesn't. And there is one congressional district in Nebraska, it's actually the city of Omaha, which Kamala Harris would need to win in order to get over the line. Otherwise, it's a 269-269 draw in the Electoral College. And in those circumstances, it goes to the House of Representatives, and the House of Representatives, the current House, Republican-dominated, voting by state blocks, would elect, indeed appoint, Donald Trump president. In those circumstances, again, it seems to me that there is a real potential for strife in America, the like of which, frankly, we have not seen in recent times. So, you know, my sense of what is about to happen in America, it is entirely possible that one of these two sides win. It is entirely possible that they pull out ahead and win actually all of the swing states. That has been done before, and a result then can look perfectly respectable for one side or the other. But it is equally entirely possible, indeed perhaps even likely, that that doesn't happen, and that there is a very, very tense period ahead for the United States. Having said that, and before I finish and take any questions that you might have, I should give you a warning that my predictions about things in America are usually hopeless. During that great tussle that Obama had with Hillary Clinton, so I was in the States up to the Obama election, and I interviewed Obama in 2009, and I became kind of really passionately interested in the Clinton-Obama struggle that's now part of history. We hardly ever talk about it, but obviously the two sides in that amazing election of 2008, on the Democratic side, each thought that they had, in a sense, a right to be the ones who took on the mantle and history. And it would have been history in her case, of course, for obvious reasons, and it was equally for obvious reasons history in his case. And they finally got to Denver and to the huge stadium where they had their final kind of convention. And it was obvious when we got there that he had won. And there was this incredible moment where she is brought into the convention stadium, and it's this massive outpouring of grief, actually, on the behalf of her supporters, and of joy and amazement on behalf of his. And they brought her they couldn't actually bring her to the podium. They got her into the middle of the room, and they handed her a microphone, and she said words to the effect of, "I now accept that Barack Obama is our nominee." And this was then the first time that a black man had been the nominee of a major political party, and a black family was possible, even likely, to go and live in the White House. And I was right in the middle of it, and I had my nose on the back of the head of an elderly African-American gentleman. We were kind of stuck in like an old-fashioned football crowd in Britain. And I thought, you know what? I had what I thought was an award-winning moment of genius. I thought, rather than go and find some kind of minor league official, because nobody will want to talk to the BBC, they'll all be doing their CNN and all the rest of it. Rather than do that, I will talk to this man who I was physically touching at a moment where everything changed in America, and so much hope for him and for his people. And my goodness, he was old enough to have known real oppression, and certainly his parents would have done if they'd lived in the South. So I thought this was a great idea. And it took us kind of 3 or 4 minutes, actually, to get to the doors. And we shook each other free, and I tapped him on the shoulder, and he turned around, and it was Sir Trevor McDonald. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I will pause, and I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm conscious I haven't talked to enough about it. Thank you.
Justin's being very generous with his time, so we do have time for some questions. I think one of the things that struck me recently about the social media is the way it drives extreme opinions as well. And it struck me as almost incredible that this week you had President Biden standing in the White House having to deny the fact that the US government had deliberately altered the weather to create the Florida hurricanes.
Yeah.
I mean, that's because that's what one of the Republican senators or one of the Republican congressmen
Marjorie Taylor
said.
Greene, a Republican congresswoman who has to be said is not the first eccentric thing that she's said, to put it mildly. But I mean, this stuff then gets believed.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting about it, Mariana Spring, my colleague who investigates social media for the BBC and does our Americast podcast, is really switched on with this thing. She was explaining to me the other day, which I don't think I'd fully grasped. We talk about social media misinformation as if it's just a thing that people put out there, and people latch onto it and whatever. But she points out that it's encouraged by the algorithms that the social media companies use. It's not a passive thing. You are encouraged to be annoyed. They want you to be annoyed. They want you to be excited by this stuff. They want you to believe, not necessarily that the government's messing around with the weather, but they want you to go in that direction because it sells more stuff for them. And it's that I think is really, really difficult for us. And that's why you saw the frustration of the president the other day, of Biden, but also of Obama. There's an amazing clip of Obama, which I really recommend for people to look at online. It's on X at the moment and various other platforms as well. Just really obviously angry and speaking with the clarity that Obama can speak, and frankly, greater clarity, I think, than Harris can manage when it comes to political communication. He's just so good at it. Saying, what on earth has happened to us? Exactly your point. Why are we having a discussion about whether the government created a hurricane? It's just crazy.
To kill its own people, which is just bizarre. First question from the audience here.
Thank you. That entertained us really well. Brilliant.
Well, I'm conscious it's the end of the day, so you don't want anything too serious.
Makes me think about holding gold, but that's another matter. You've got to be expecting this question. So going back to the beginning of your talk, regarding the social media and the problems of engaging with politicians and I guess their ability to be proper leaders and speak the truth. Wait for that.
You're going to ask me who, aren't you?
Oh, never mind. I'm going to say it's more of a what. I think we need to do something about it, you said.
Yeah.
Your argument's very persuasive, but do you have any ideas?
Yeah.
What could actually be done?
It's a reasonable question. I mean, there are two approaches, it seems to me. One, that we just get wise to it. And we kind of gradually, and I think that's sort of where we find ourselves at the moment, that gradually as societies, we just evolve to cope, as we've evolved to cope with, the wireless and newspapers and all the other things that at various stages have thought to be a threat. I think the danger with that approach is that this stuff fiddles with our minds, actually, and affects the way that we treat each other, and is very difficult simply to cope with. And I wonder whether there is more of a coping mechanism that happens earlier on, particularly in childhood, that we've got to look at. But it is, it's a perfectly reasonable question. And the honest answer is I haven't the foggiest idea.
Any other questions? There's one gentleman in the middle here, and then another one on the left there. Tamara, if you can see the hand with the gentleman in the jumper.
Thanks. Justin, actually, the law that allows the big tech companies to not take responsibility for what is posted on, if that were repealed, what are the chances of that ever happening, and would that be a good thing? I can't even remember.
Whether it's a good thing or not, it's probably not for me to say. As a BBC guy, I'm not. I genuinely don't have an opinion, and my opinion wouldn't be of interest to you anyway. But having said that, there is a really significant move. Well, what's interesting about it in the States is it is this bipartisan. There's not much they agree on across the aisle. Probably don't like China. It turns out they're keener on the Democratic side on tariffs than people thought they would have been when Trump introduced them and they didn't get rid of them. So, there are some bipartisan things going on. But specifically on the subject of the idea that the social media companies are made to take the same editorial responsibility as newspapers. I wonder whether the horse has already bolted, as it were, that actually it would be so difficult to organize now without a breaking up of those companies that realistically it's beyond certainly the current crop of American politicians, particularly because of the difficulty in getting enough people in the center, as it were, to understand what the concerns are of the people on, or what you might see as both, they're not exactly extremes, but both sides of the party. So you need to bring together Elizabeth Warren on what is, broadly speaking, the left of the Democratic Party, with Josh Hawley and a few others on the right of the Republican Party. It's not impossible, but it's this business of it's the kind of concerted action that used to be the absolute meat and drink of Congress back in the 80s, I suppose, with Reagan and Tip O'Neill when he was in charge of the House of Representatives for the Democrats, getting things done. There is so little getting things done, even the smaller things, that the idea of a really big thing like that, I think at the moment is probably beyond them.
Justin, we had a question on the side here.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. What I find absolutely staggering when I see this, following on your comment about the thunderstorm, how these senior Republican delegates of a serious background can look themselves in the mirror and say the election was stolen without producing anything of evidence to show it. Yeah. They're not all stupid.
No.
Some of them.
Not stupid.
But they actually stand up in public and say that.
Yeah.
How come?
Yeah. Because they have convinced themselves that there is a political expediency in doing it, and there is little downside in doing it politically. Because of the way that American politics is at the moment, you will not lose support in your own party for taking an extreme position, specifically in the Republican Party when it comes to that, because of the way the primaries work, because of the way politicians are chosen, because of the gerrymandering of congressional districts, which means that you can take as an extreme position as you like. In fact, you are paid for taking an extreme position because it makes it more likely that you will keep your seat and not have someone standing against you. So it's a breakage that goes all the way down American politics, right down to the business of first standing for office and getting chosen for office. It is that foundational. And until those things are sorted out, it won't change. They can be sorted out, it seems to me. I do think both parties actually face considerable vociferous tendencies, if that's the right word, that pull them apart and allow then a greater breadth of debate within them. But at the moment, the reward that you get in the Republican Party for saying those things is bigger than the condemnation of a few of your peers and the other side. And while that is the case, they're still going to say it.
There's a question down there in the front row. Deborah. Oh, sorry. Tamara, have you got a microphone?
Here we go.
Here we go. It's on its way. I think the gentleman with the mustardy-coloured jumper on the end had his hand up first, so thank you.
Thank you. Could you explain just why half of the American public want to vote for Donald Trump to be president again?
That's a good question. It's one we often go to on Americast. I've just done an interview with James Carville, which is our latest Americast edition. James Carville, Raging Cajun, the guy who got Clinton elected. It's the economy stupid was his famous phrase. I mean, he's an old guy now, but my goodness, he's still very switched on to all of these things. And I actually asked him that, I think, pretty much exactly. And he you know, Carville's response is they're deluded, and, you know, it's the Hillary Clinton thing, they're a basket of deplorables, that he would absolutely not say that, because he comes from these people, in a sense, and Carville comes from poorer white stock in Louisiana, and has an understanding, I suppose, of the pressures that there have been on them in not just the Trump era, and even the pre-Trump era, but the last sort of 30 to 40 years of American life. And I think you can legitimately say, you look at the huge changes in the patterns of wealth in the United States at around the time that Reagan became president, and to an extent before. You look at everything that's happened since then. You look at the financial crisis. You look at the way in which time and time again, people who are on the coastal elites, people who are, and it's not the top 1%, it's not even top 2%, it's probably the top 5 or 10% of Americans, increasingly manage to seal themselves off from the rest of the nation, and at the same time as sealing themselves off, used the language of condescension and even active dislike of the rest of the nation. And that was, the thinking then goes, the fuse that just needed a spark. And Trump, in a sense, was the spark. But actually, the reasons why people are so hacked off with the American political system are genuine and heartfelt, it seems to me, and do not necessarily stem from just a kind of, don't also stem from social media. I think you can blame too much on social media. I think there are real reasons why Donald Trump came to power, and a real anger about the way that America is. It's incoherent because it's, you know, he's a billionaire. I mean, and also in his first term in office didn't exactly do very much for these people. Although it's fair to say that the blue-collar economy was booming until COVID. And that's actually, so to kind of narrow the answer to your question down to why might he win this time, rather than why is he an attractive political figure at all, the reason he might win this time is that there is a kind of Trump nostalgia. And people look back to the early days before COVID, particularly blue-collar workers, and think, actually, you know what, that was a pretty good time for me. So those combinations of things, the overall context, but also the specific facts of the Trump presidency for certain groups of Americans are why he's still in the position he's in.
I'm going to take one more question on this side. Lady in the middle there.
Thanks. Justin, under either circumstance, under either Harris or Trump, what do you think will happen to the special relationship?
Yeah.
It's
really interesting, isn't it? I mean, well, I never believed in the special relationship. My last day in the White House, I went to see. So Obama had been elected, and I went to see a person there. Everything's off the record there, so I can't tell you who it was. But if you'd followed the Obama White House in those times, very prominent figure. I got like 10 minutes with him to say goodbye. And I said to him, why did you get rid of the bust of Winston Churchill that had been in the Bush Oval Office? You remember this was a great issue, kind of special relationship, broken issue. Why did you do that? I said, what was your thinking? And he looked at me and he said, we thought it was Eisenhower. He said, one elderly white guy looks much like another to us. And you know, he's only half joking. And actually, you have this sense constantly where for them, we are occasionally useful, the relationship is occasionally transactional and importantly so, but usually they don't even think about it. And I don't think that changes, to be honest, in either case. I think Trump can get on perfectly well, even with David Lammy, who once called him a sociopath and worse. It doesn't seem to worry him. And I think genuinely won't, provided there's a little bit of an apology behind the scenes. And, you know, if there are things they can do. So I actually think the Trump-Starmer relationship, or you wouldn't think it's a marriage born in heaven, but I don't think it's necessarily worse than any other relationship. And you think back to Blair and W, and it really taking off in a way that nobody expected back in the day. And with Harris, you know, again, you might expect, oh, it's Labour and it's Harris, and there were people. I was in Chicago for the convention, and there were Labour people who came across and had talks, and bumped into Alistair Campbell there and various other people of this era too, who are very much, sorry, I see, it's not that you're not of this era, but you know what I mean. But there's this kind of sense that we expect that a Labour government will get on better with the Democrats, and the Democrats will somehow, you know, listen to what we say. I mean, really? She's going to have an awful lot on her plate. And even if she knows where Britain is, I doubt it's going to be top of her agenda.
Justin, I'm going to take, we're virtually out of time. I'm going to take
I know, people have got trains to catch.
I'm going to take the host's prerogative to ask the last question, which is, perhaps given that you joined the BBC in 1984, a slightly soft one. But I've got 2 teenage children, and back to your algorithms point, one of the things that worries me, and we've seen with the Trump supporters and their beliefs around the 2020 election as well, is that the algorithms just feed you more of what you look for. Yeah. So they just reinforce more extreme opinions. Where do younger people, where do we go to find things, articles, news and things which challenge our opinions? And so in the context of your role at the BBC, what you do on the Today programme, how can we maintain the value of empower, impartial broadcasting and, you know, challenging opinions?
It's a really important point.
We should all be challenged.
Yeah. So my boss the other day, Deborah Cohen, did a talk about all of this. And one of the really interesting things that was brought up is this business of whether or not people are still interested in the idea of impartiality. It's not that impartial broadcasters get everything right. Obviously, they don't. But it's that when they get it wrong, they're willing to say, oh, we got that wrong. And that's, you know, the kind of thing that you're talking about and searching for. The only way we keep that is by enthusiastically backing it. And that doesn't mean enthusiastically backing the BBC in any particular shape or form. That's not for me. Though it's very much for you. It's very much for listeners and viewers. And what Deborah Turness is interested in, and I think it's such an important point that we possibly don't talk about enough, is this sense of whether we can engender not support for the BBC or support for any particular public broadcasting organisation, but support for the idea that coming across things with which you disagree is not bad for you. It's actually good for you. And somehow, and I think, you know, everyone in this room will sense that that is the case. And for all of our lives, it has been the case. And our working lives as well. It's good to be challenged by things. But if you go down the road where even being challenged mildly by something you disagree with is painful to you and you just switch off, then that's the danger. So it's encouraging people of our children's age not to go down that road, but to stick to the road that we've kind of all pretty much been on.
Excellent. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's really nice to be here. Thank you.
And thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And I just wish you all a very safe travel home this evening. Thank you and enjoy the weekend.